because the assumption behind so many Protestant faiths is that the early church was all right.
That's
but
right.
At some point in time it encountered a fork in the road and took the wrong fork. All right. And some push it all the way to Leo the Great, which would have been after Augustine.
Right, right.
So you could push, well, Augustine had some good things, but he had all that burden on his back. And so were you thinking that? Were you looking for, was there an earlier time or a later time?
I can remember specifically the day I figured out that Augustine was a Catholic and that he really, really did not hold to Luther's views. Rushing in and finding a Lutheran friend of mine and saying, where do I go now? What father should I read? You know, where do I? And he didn't have an answer. But I began to look and went back to the 3rd century, the 2nd century, and it was even more terrifying because the earlier I went, the less like Protestants they looked. And the doctrine of the 2nd century church was even farther removed from Luther. So then I thought, well, maybe I need to re-examine the writings of St. Paul. So I'm going to go back to my Greek text. I'm going to go back to the Bible. I'm going to look at Scripture itself and see, can I find Luther in the writings of St. Paul? And I thought, I'm going to go to the authorities. I'm going to get all the helps I can. I'm going to look at the Greek text, but I'm going to look at Protestant biblical scholars. I'm not going to look at any Catholics. I really want to convince myself of the truth of the Lutheran position on Scripture. So I go find Protestant biblical scholars. And I happen across this movement called the New Perspectives on Paul, which is a movement in Protestant biblical scholarship that attempts to interpret Paul in light of his Jewish context in the 1st century. And these are first-class biblical scholars, all of them Protestants, all of them with Protestant view of the Bible as the sole rule of faith. And I come to find out that the best in Protestant scholarship in the 20th century rejects Luther. And they're not Catholics. Their point of view on Paul is not entirely Catholic, but they provided me with a framework for seeing that Paul also could not really truthfully and honestly be read from a Lutheran point of view. Luther misunderstood Paul. And so from the sources of the faith, from the fathers of the church, and from the best in Protestant scholarship, I eventually came to the position that justification by faith alone was a 16th century invention by a Saxon monk who had left the church and was no part of historic Christianity. And yet, I still didn't consider becoming Catholic, but my faith was shaken.
Can I ask where your wife was in all this?
She was taking care of our kids.
Okay.
And it was years. This process went on for years and
Sure.
years. So it was a long time before she began to see that I was having some theological difficulties.